Okay, welcome everybody to this first Eurodoc webinar that we're giving on mental health. Specifically, the title of this webinar is How to Stay Sane in Academia, Ways for Combating Stress and Uncertainty. So welcome to everybody following us on YouTube Live. Before I go into any of the speakers or presentations, just so you know, we have in the Facebook event and also on the YouTube Live section underneath in the comments, there is a link to all of the presentations that we will give. So you can basically follow us in our presentations as we go through this. The webinar will last 1.5 hours from 3 o'clock Central European Time to 16:30 Central European Time. And what we have is, I will give a brief introduction on Eurodoc and why mental health is an important topic. Then we will have 3 experts giving us their opinions on mental health. Inge van der Weijden from Leiden University, Ekaterina Vinnik, and Joaquim Alves de Silva. Now, let me share my screen with you. Okay, so before I start, let me make sure this is on. If you see the QR code I have there in the screen, and also there is a Google short link. So if you type in the Google short link, or if you take a picture of the QR code, then you will be able to access all of our presentations. So I'll give a couple of seconds for you just to note down the link or to take a picture of the QR code. And then you can access this presentation and all the presentations that will come. So I'll give 10 minutes. Sorry, 10 seconds. Okay, so my name is Gareth O'Neill. I'm the president of the European Council of Doctoral Candidates and Junior Researchers, basically Eurodoc for short. We are a non-profit organization based in Brussels since 2002 now, and our members are national associations representing doctoral candidates and postdoctoral researchers across Europe. Currently, we have 29 of these national associations, and we speak for a large majority of the early career researchers across Europe. This is a volunteer organization. We have 38 members this year in our administration, and we are funded and fully supported by all of our associations. So it is run for and by early career researchers. Now, what we do is we develop policies in Eurodoc at a national level and at a European level, and we run different events on various topics, and we also have many working groups at Eurodoc where early career researchers can get involved and help us shape policies. So some examples of working groups that we have are, for instance, a working group on open science, a working group on career development, and also a new working group on mental health. Now, what we see is for early career researchers, there are quite a lot of issues that keep them very, very busy and at times stressed. So everybody is aware of the publish or perish mentality in academia. Basically, early career researchers need to publish quite a lot, and they need to publish in high impact factor journals. But that's not all they do, of course. They train and they support students, they give lectures, they also go to conferences, they also have to do various tasks at the universities or institutions. They, in principle, have quite a wide variety of activities that keep them busy. Now, one of the other issues that is very important to them is the decision whether or not to stay in academia. Now, when we ask early career researchers if they want to stay, a large majority, as you can see in the figure underneath on the left there, will actually want to stay in academia. It's around 80+%. However, when we look across Europe and see how many PhDs can actually stay in academia, then it's a much lower figure, usually between 30, 40, even in best cases, 50%. So while many PhDs want to stay in academia, most of them must leave. And this leads to a certain level of anxiety and also the fact that they need to be skilled and trained if they're to leave academia. And something more current since the last couple of years at a European and national level is open science. So researchers are now expected to open up their science, open up their research publications, open up their research data, And we know from surveys that many early career researchers are not fully aware how to do this, and also that they want to do this, but there's no real support at their institutions. So we see a lot of different issues for early career researchers that keep them essentially busy and somewhat under pressure. Which brings us to the topic of mental health. So mental health has been an issue in academia for many years, but what we see is that it's been relatively a taboo and a topic not necessarily to be spoken about. Many researchers don't want to admit, for instance, if there are issues with their supervisor, or perhaps if they're feeling slightly stressed or anxious, that in fact they feel this. They don't want to be negatively looked upon by supervisors or colleagues, and they're also afraid that this might impact upon their future careers. So at Eurodoc, we started trying to address this taboo several years ago through articles like the one on the screen, through various events, through various other articles online in the media. And we're quite happy and confident to say that this topic has become somewhat of a major issue in Europe. And one of the big reasons also for this is several surveys that have been conducted in the last couple of years to actually see who is stressed and to what extent are they stressed. So one of the big surveys that we know is the Nature PhD survey, which is done every 2 years. That's the first image on the left there. And essentially, this shows that a high level of doctoral candidates have actually said that they feel anxious or stressed. You can click the links underneath if you want to access the survey data. Now, one of the bombshell surveys a couple of years ago in 2016 that came out was by Champalimaud and co. on a study on doctoral candidates in Flanders in Belgium. And when we look at the statistics here marked in red in the middle, we see that a high percentage of doctoral candidates felt stressed or anxious, and that this was around 40%, and around 30% of doctoral candidates showed signs of clinical depression, so statistical signs of clinical depression. This article that was published became, I think, the second most cited article that year in Science, showing that there was a real outcry and interest in mental health in academia. And a follow-on study that was conducted in the Netherlands in Leiden University, which has been now extended by Inge van der Weijden, who will talk right after me, also showed similar signs of stress, anxiety, and possible signs of clinical depression. Now, this was a smaller cohort of individuals, but we see that the numbers were actually slightly higher. So what's clear is that mental health is a topic that is very much of interest to early career researchers, and that the statistics are showing worrying signs of mental health issues. And one of the major questions is, where is this coming from? What is it causing? Now, we have asked many early career researchers, what are the reasons why you do a PhD, and what are some of the negative aspects of a PhD? And if you see on the screen here, a survey we did at Leiden University last year under about 150, 160 of their doctoral candidates, you see some of these major words coming out. So one of the reasons why PhDs actually do a PhD, what they like about it is the independence, the fact that they learn more. It's a challenge. They're very, very passionate about research, and essentially they're looking into their curiosity and the freedom to do research. And these are some of the things that positive emotions, let's say, that will keep them going through the PhD and really pushing them to finish this PhD and continue a career in academia. Now, when we ask them what are some of the issues that you have, some of the problems that you have with doing a PhD, then there's a couple of words that really stick out: stress, pressure, uncertainty, supervisor, in some cases freedom, competition, publishing, failure. So these are the things that are weighing down upon these doctoral candidates, and basically they need support for this. Now, it's not that one of these issues cause mental health. Essentially, we have a whole range of issues that can push down and stress and make doctoral candidates anxious, such as, for instance, the so-called imposter syndrome, publish or perish. Of course, the stress attached to having to publish or be excellent. There are a whole wide range of issues, and I think our next speakers are going to tell us a little bit more about that. From the Eurodoc side, what we basically ask people to do is to basically look outside of just your research, try and get skills other than solely research, communication skills, lifelong learning skills, leadership skills, things that can help you personally and in your career, time management, but ultimately not just focus on your research. Try and get out, try and have somewhat of a social life outside of only research. It's not all about university. If you feel that you're under pressure or you feel that things are not working out, then talk to your friends, talk to perhaps colleagues, and in situations where you think it's getting out of control and you feel very, very lonely, in which case then you try to contact an expert either at your institution or at the university. So usually there's a psychologist at the university, or there's some kind of contact point for issues in academia. Okay, I'm going to stop up there and I'm going to go on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Inge van der Weijden from Leiden University. She's a researcher there. She's also working on mental health issues. And Inge is going to talk about a survey that she did and her colleagues on the mental health of doctoral candidates. So I'm going to hand over the floor now to you, Inge.
Well, thank you, Gareth. Welcome everybody to this webinar. And my name is Inge van der Weijden. And as Gareth already introduced me, I work at Leiden University as a senior researcher, but also as a lecturer at the Center for Science and Technology Studies. But next to that, I'm also working since January at the University of Applied Sciences in Amsterdam, and I work on the topic of higher education there. And for a lot of years, I conduct research on career development of academics, and who also can go outside academia or also study their transition from academia to non-academia. And finally, I'm also board member of the Center of Expertise for the Dutch PhD training. And today in this webinar, I'm going to present the outcomes of a survey study and some interviews that we did in Leiden University. And this is a collaboration with the already mentioned Katja Levesque from Flanders in Belgium. We did a study together with her and with my colleagues Ingeborg Meijer and Ingeborg van de Ven. We did this study in 2017 because we wanted to collect some systematic empirical data on mental health of PhD candidates in Leiden University. And so far in the Netherlands, before that time, there was only little research, and only at the UvA in Amsterdam, there was more or less a report on mental health. So really, we wanted to know about the mental health of the PhD candidates in Leiden. We wanted to assess the scope of that problem by comparing it to other samples or groups, like, for example, the outcomes of Flanders PhDs. And we also wanted to better understand how the perceptions of the academic working conditions, as Gareth already mentioned a few of them, how they even may relate to mental health, including stress, of course. So what did we do? We sent an online questionnaire to all our PhD candidates in Leiden University. Unfortunately, there is not a real registration system for PhD candidates. So the Dutch PhD Association of Leiden was so kind to distribute this questionnaire to all their members. And the topics that were addressed in this questionnaire were more or less the same as the study in Flanders. So we wanted to know more about the type of appointments of the PhD candidates, because in the Netherlands you can have an employee status, so you have a contract with the university, but you can also come from outside the Netherlands with a scholarship or an external grant, so then you don't have an employee status. And the third category is that you can be a part-time external PhD candidate, and that means that you work in your spare time on your PhD. Also, we ask questions about the different tasks, the perceived autonomy in your research projects, about the satisfaction with your supervisors, and some questions about the kind of leadership that your supervisors are having, and of course also about your future career opportunities. What do you want with your academic life after your PhD? We finally asked some questions about experience work-life balance, about the perceived workloads, and finally about the mental health. And therefore, we used a general health questionnaire. I will come back to that later in this webinar. And we also conducted, as I said, semi-structured interviews with 12 PhDs in Leiden. Before I go to the results, let me first tell you something about the general health questionnaire. This is a most widely used instrument. It's a screening instrument in occupational health research. It was also used by the study in Flanders, and it consists of 12 items. And I can give you one example. These 12 items were all related to general health. And one example is, how have you been feeling the last few weeks? That's the more general question. Then the item could be, for example, being able to concentrate on whatever you are doing. And we asked the PhDs to report their current problems and not the ones that they had a couple of months or years ago. So you can then score yourself as, well, I feel better than usually, or just as good as usually, well, more worse than usually, or a lot of worse than usually. And if you think or have the feeling that you are worse than usually or a lot worse than usually, then we give that as a positive score on that item. So that questionnaire works. And you are in a risk, really a risk on running into mental health problems, especially running into a depression, if you have a positive score on a minimal of 4 symptoms. And we call that general health Q4+. So that's good to remember for the continuation of this talk. This general health questionnaire was also used a couple of years ago in UK and in Australia, and of course in Belgium. So this was the 4th time that we used the questionnaire. A little bit about the PhD candidates that responded to our research. As I told you, there were 283 candidates, more or less 50% males, females, with an average age of 31 years old. 60 of them had a Dutch nationality, and 75% have a partner, and 1 out of 5 have already children. And most of them had a job contract, 71%, though we were called employees of the Leiden University. To give you some background information about the Dutch PhDs in Leiden. I will go to the results, and you will see here the percentage of all the 12 items that we asked in the general health questionnaire. And as you can see, 47% of our PhD candidates, that respondents, have the feeling that they are under constant stress. So they have a high level of stress. And you see them in the second row, 4 other items that more or less 32% of the PhD says, well, I have that kind of unhappiness or depressed feeling, or I lost sleep because I worried so much. I couldn't overcome my difficulties and I lost lots of concentration. So that are quite high numbers, quite high percentages. And on the third row, you see another 6 items that 1 out of 5 PhD scored as positive. And it goes from lost in my self-confidence to not enjoying day-to-day activities because I'm still worrying about my PhD. And not feeling happy, all the things considered, to I couldn't face any problems anymore. So that are really serious ones. In the end, 50% indicated that I felt worthless as a person. When we compare these percentages to the things that we know from the PhD candidates in Flanders, and there we have, as Gareth already told you in the beginning, that 32% of the PhD candidates report that they are running into risk of a clinical depression, so that they have serious mental health problems. And we see this percentage in Leiden is 38%, GHQ4+, as I just explained to you. And when we compare it with statistics from students in higher education in Flanders, unfortunately, we don't have that statistics in the Netherlands, but we have figures from Flanders. We see that its percentage is quite lower, that's 22%. And when we compared our figures with the highly educated employees in Flanders, we see that their percentage of running into mental health issues is only 12%. With our survey data, we could also say something about the risk factors, because we run a lot of regressions. And when you see it as a risk factor, when you turn it around, it could be an opportunity to prevent yourself from mental health issues. The first risk factor is the amount of work pressure and workload that the PhD candidates experience. And the second one is that there is so much work pressure, and in some way they are running into risk that they cannot deal with that work pressure anymore, and then they really cut into serious problems. And this is correlated with people that wanted to stay in academia but have a very negative view on their future career perspective. So they even become more and more stressed because of a lot of competition that there is in academia. So especially the negative view on your career perspective as an academic has a negative impact on your mental health. When we go to the second risk factors, and that's more or less has something to do with the perceived supervision that the PhD candidates got. We see that the ones in our survey that said, well, we are not satisfied with the supervision so far, that there are 39 PhD candidates who have that feeling, and that they are very, very unsatisfied with the received supervision. You see more than 50% has a GHQ-4 plus score, so is running into a risk of developing a mental health problems. We also see a correlation between people that say, well, I have the feeling that I don't receive enough social support from my supervisors. And that is also one of the risk factors of getting into mental health problems. Another question that asked in our questionnaire is thinking about quitting your PhD research in general, so thinking about dropping out. And we see a remarkable high percentage of people that say, well, at some point in my PhD, I was thinking about quitting with my research at all. So that's 43%. And especially the persons that have that feeling not only once, but even every month, have a very high GHQ-4 plus percentage. So that's also negatively related with mental health issues. Going to the final risk factors that we identified with this survey, and that has to do with social demographics, and especially international PhD candidates that come from outside the Netherlands to the Netherlands to do their PhD have really a higher percentage of running into risk of developing mental health issues. And especially from the interviews, we learned that this has something to do with the limited knowledge of the Dutch system, the Dutch academia, but also with the cultural differences that they experienced, especially during the first 2 years of their PhD life, the feeling of loneliness and difficulties with social adaptation. So that comes out of the interviews. And the final social demographic thing that I wanted to present is that we see that PhD candidates, and especially female PhD candidates with small children, they find it very difficult to give a good work-life balance with their PhD research and with their family life. And we don't see that with male PhD candidates. So that's very interesting and also something to discuss. Of course, there are also a lot of items that didn't have any relationship with mental health in general. And that was the gender of the PhD candidates. And that was quite different compared to the study in Flanders, where we see that especially female PhD candidates have a higher risk of running into mental health issues, but we don't see that in Leiden. Also, the type of appointment, so if you are a grant PhD or an employee PhD, that doesn't matter. The experienced amount of autonomy in your PhD project didn't have any relationship, nor has the work-life balance for the male PhD candidates. And we also studied the different type of leadership that supervisors have, and we don't see any differences among different styles of leadership and the relationship with mental health problems. To conclude, we see in this study that 38 of the PhD candidates in Leiden report at least 4 symptoms at the GHQ-12 questionnaire. And we can then say or indicate that they are running at risk of having or developing a common psychiatric disorder, and that's most often depression. And the most prevalent top 3 feelings are feeling under constant stress, feeling unhappy, and feeling depressed, and have sleeping problems due to worries about your PhD. And what I just show you, that work context variables are predictors as well as nationality is. And in the final part of my presentation, I hope that I have some time left. I wanted to give some recommendations for you, for the PhDs. I see that I have 2 minutes, so I will run a little bit out of time, I guess. First, we developed some recommendations for PhD candidates. As Gareth already explained to you, please talk about these issues. Talk about it with your other PhD fellows and seek for help if it's really getting serious. Also, that you can think of building independent PhD mentoring groups, or we call it also intervision groups. And there, for example, you can meet every 2 or 4 weeks, just informal, that you also develop the feeling of trust among yourselves. And regarding career stress, please try to decrease that stress by start thinking already in the early phase of your PhD about what can I do and what are the options after the finishing of my PhD. And just realize that staying in academia is one of the options, and there are a lot of more options that you can do with your PhD. And then also we formulated recommendations for supervisors, and especially we wanted to recommend supervisors to attend training programs. And we see now more and more training programs for supervisors that includes also cross-cultural communications issues, for example. But also it focused on how to identify if my PhD candidate has some mental health problems. How can I reset up that conversation to talk about these personal things? And the second one is to be transparent with regard to the requirements that you give your PhD candidates. Because we see in the interviews that a lot of people don't and not exactly know what being expected from them as a PhD, about the number of articles, but also the number of experiments, for example. So making the implicit explicit, that's vital for all PhDs. And also as a final recommendation for supervisors, also to get in their mindset a change that the PhD, after your PhD, you can do all kinds of knowledge-intensive jobs, and the academic career is just one of them. And with that, I would like to thank you for listening to this talk, and I will give the floor back to Gareth.
Thank you, Inge. Just be aware your screen is still on the presentation if you want to stop that so we can see you. A question from one of the audience members, just a short question. So if you remember the slide I had where we did a survey using Mentimeter under about 160 doctoral candidates in Leuven, and we asked them what are some of the negative sides of doing a PhD, or what are some of the things that stress you. And one of the audience members noted that 2 words were there. One was supervisor and one was promoter, both very large. Now, I know in the Netherlands, those 2 things can be slightly different, the promoter being the actual person who gives the PhD, and the supervisor possibly being the one who actually does a lot of the real supervision, like a daily supervisor. But the comment was that if you put those two words together, they would probably be the biggest factor causing, let's say, some of the stress. What do you think of this?
Yes, I definitely agree with that. That's also what we see, especially in the interviews, because in the questionnaire we asked about the feelings and the experience with the promoter. And we have a different question about the dagelijks begeleider, as we call it in the Netherlands, so the daily supervisor. And we see when we combine that satisfaction with your supervisor, whatever the supervisor that may be, has a very high impact on your mental health feelings.
Okay, that's quite clear.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Inge. I'm going to jump on to our next speaker. Let me pull this up. And our next speaker is Joaquim Alves da Silva. And Joaquim is in Lisbon, I believe, at the Champalimaud Center of the Unknown. And he is going to talk about how to recognize warning signs of a breakdown. So I'll give the floor to you, Joaquim.
Hi, I just wanted to start by thanking the organizers for this great meeting on such an important subject. I was thinking, like, what could I bring to the table in this discussion? And one thing, I'm an MD, so I'm a psychiatrist, specialized in psychiatry. But more than that, I believe that also because I recently went through a PhD, and I kind of can connect to the subject there, and then maybe trying to bring the two things together, like the clinical expertise and having experienced the PhD, and try to talk about really what is stress, how to recognize that we are getting stressed, and also some advices that I believe can help. Some of them are generalized for stress. Some of them would be more focused on the academia, and I will probably repeat some of the things that Gareth and Inge have said on the advice on how to protect yourself from stress in the academic environment. So I just wanted to start by thinking a bit about what is stress. Stress, many times we hear the word stress, we think about the bad thing, but in fact, stress is there for a good thing. So biologically, stress is a response that enables us to increase our chances of survival. This is very easy to understand when we think about the zebra in the savannah, and then suddenly a lioness comes, and then the zebra has to either run for her life or try to fight it off. The same stress response that happens with the zebra is not that different from the stress response we have. What is different is our ability to engage in the stress, and our ability to project ourselves in time. What I mean by this is that a zebra faces a stress. It's an acute stress. It gives cognitive changes, emotional changes, and physiological changes that are relevant to either fight or flight, but it's acute. In this famous book, which I recommend you all to read, it's a very, very interesting story on the science of stress by Robert Sapolsky. The title is very expressive. It says, "Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers," and alluding to the fact that zebras get acute stresses, but unlike us, they are not in the soup of chronic stress that can really harm us. So what is stress in this human version? So in the human, our brain is something magnificent. That's why I'm also a neuroscientist. It's very appealing to try to understand how the brain works. So one thing we know that the human brain is able to do is to project itself in the future. So it's a great, let's say, great machine that tries to predict what's going to happen. And one thing we can do is we can travel in time. So we can project ourselves in time, which also means that we can project in time stresses that are not actually happening right now, but we can make them happen right now just by recalling them. And that makes us very prone to, even in our cars in traffic, getting stressed, just thinking of all the things we need to do, or, for example, in the PhD, try anticipating all the things that we need to do, can easily call up this stressful response. Sally in the 50s, he came up with this theory of the general adaptation syndrome, which was much more thought on the physiological stress response and not so much on, let's say, the psychological aspects of stress. But it can really, it's good to make a parallel between the two. So Sally would say that in the initial response of stress, there is an alarm, and the body starts to respond in a way that will improve our capability to get over the stress. And there is a phase where our body, our physiology, is trying to resist whatever is causing the stress. But if this stress goes on and it becomes chronic, then the systems are exhausted, let's say. So many times we try to establish a parallel between this general adaptation syndrome and what happens in the psychological aspects of chronic stress, where the stress is there initially to make us better, so more prepared to act, and for a while it kind of sustains us and enable us to work on a increased rhythm. But at a certain point we pay the toll and we start having symptoms which which bring with them some dysfunction that gets in our way. One very tricky thing is that with mental health in general, but let's focus on stress in particular, is that stress is accompanied by mental symptoms that exist in a continuum that goes from normal to pathological, right? So many times I would discuss this with patients. Our aim is not to take all the emotions away, right? When we are trying to treat somebody, we don't want a person without anxiety. Anxiety is there many times to teach us something, to make us alert and prepare us to do better. But at a certain point, we get into this pathological anxiety. While normal anxiety is the anxiety we get, autonomic nervous system activation that helps us to focus on the challenge we have at hand, and the level of anxiety is proportional to that challenge and also limited in time. Pathological anxiety is many times disproportionate to the challenge. It's more prolonged, more severe, and sometimes people can even elicit it just by focusing on internal reactions and changes. So what is to be anxious? I'm not going to do a lot on this, but there is typical, let's say, symptoms of anxiety that can go from your changes in appearance and behavior, like you can become more agitated. There is what we call the neurovegetative activation, so you can be more, let's say, your increased heart rate, muscle tension, etc. Many times people which are chronically anxious, they are more irritable, and the thought contents, they become focused on worrying, many times anticipation of problems, and also fears which may be more or less diffuse. Cognitive-wise, anxiety has a tendency to after certain amounts to make it difficult to concentrate and even impair your memory. Of course, depending on severity, an anxious person may exhibit some of this or all of this at the same time. Also, very importantly, anxiety comes with physical symptoms, sometimes even mimicking physical disorders. It's not uncommon that a person suffering from stress or anxiety will look for a GP first and not a psychologist or a psychiatrist, because many times it will first complain of gastrointestinal symptoms like abdominal discomfort or changes in bowel movements, or even respiratory changes like thoracic discomfort, faster breathing, or even more kind of neurological symptoms like a tremor or a sensation like changes in sensation, like the feeling of pins and needles in the tips of the hands, for example. A very, very common symptom is the insomnia. Insomnia, when it becomes chronic, associated with anxiety, can be very highly debilitating. Many times, anxiety symptoms, especially during a stress which is continuous and chronic, can also be exist at the same time as the depressive symptoms. The typical depressive symptoms are, of course, the changes in mood. So your mood gets lower, you more sad. You also have something which is the second most important symptom, which is called anhedonia, which is a lack of pleasure in things that were pleasurable to you before. And many times people are very tearful. There's also some neglect of the self-care. If symptoms get more serious, you may even get anorexia, and you may lose weight. In the thought process, people become more slow. The thoughts can become contaminated with depressive cognitions, which is a very important part of depression, because it's like the snowball effect, right? People they are in a bad situation. They might be in a bad situation, but it will always appear worse than it is in fact. And this will, let's say, feed the depression into a higher intensity. Cognitive, also in the thought, it's not uncommon for people to have death-related thoughts or even suicidal thoughts. Cognitive-wise, attention and concentration deficits are very common, and sometimes people, even one of the first symptoms they will report is they are suffering from some kind of memory impairment. So now let's try to focus a bit more the stress response and this symptoms, the mental health symptoms that I've just discussed, into the workplace. Okay, and in academia, it's, let's say, a specific situation related to the workplace experience. Many times when we talk about this kind of anxiety, depressive related symptoms, in regard to the workplace, we talk about burnout syndrome. The first descriptions of burnout syndrome were made by Freudenberger in '74, and in his own words, you would be talking about a syndrome that to do becoming exhausted by making excessive demands on energy, strength, or resources brought about by devotion to a cause, way of life, or relationship that failed to produce the expected reward. There is some controversy regarding this syndrome, because it's not a specific medical diagnosis, which, in my opinion, is not highly relevant for the purpose of this webinar. But if you want, you can consider it as an adjustment disorder, in which the stress is very specifically the work you're doing. And that leads to affective changes like the depressive and anxiety symptoms I have just told you about, and some conduct changes. So how to recognize the burnout? There are three main components. There are physical component, which is much related to the physical symptoms of depression and anxiety that I just told you about. Then there are emotional components, which are basically the emotional components of anxiety and depression. And then there are typical behavioral changes, which are much more specific to the burnout syndrome. We're talking about job insatisfaction, absenteeism, unstable in the workplace, and a cynic and critic attitude and posture regarding the job. How can this, if we think about academia, how can this presentation be? Okay, so how it may look if we look specifically into the academic environment. So this comes from an interesting paper in Nature that I will leave. There is in the end of the presentation. There's a link there. And it could look like things like not going to work or not getting out of bed, losing interest in research that used to be exciting and interesting. So a shift in the conduct of the person, not meeting basic needs like eating, exercise, and family time, for example, making more mistakes than usual at work, and everyday lab tasks seem like a chore, inability to concentrate on analysis or reading, being short, intolerant, or overly sensitive with colleagues, catching illnesses more often, not sleeping well, or having feelings of low confidence. This is a very simple model on what many times happens, and this is particular academia and PhD time. It's particularly sensitive to this. So you can imagine these balloons as what people call the self concept. So how you see yourself. Okay? I see myself as a physician, but also as a father, as a husband, as a paddle player, etc. So you have these different facets, right? Sometimes what happens is that the job part, or the PhD in this case in particular, assumes a big preponderance. As Inge said, in the PhD environment, there are things that facilitate this. For example, many people are out of their environment, so those multiple facets they add, they become less preponderant, or it becomes more tough to feed them. So the job becomes a big part of what you are, and that's okay in the beginning. You are very enthusiastic. You have all this fantasy sometimes of all things will go on, and they don't go like that. So when the job starts failing, the other parts cannot hold you up because you have not been feeding them. This is seeing things from, let's say, the self-concept part, but an important part in stress that I didn't mention before. I only talked about response to a stressor, but the big part in stress response is how we evaluate our ability to fight back stress. That's our coping mechanism. So in the Lazarus model, it's not only important if we think something is stressful, it's also very important whether we think or not that we can fight it. So in this paper by Dan in academic psychiatry, they had this notion of coping reserve. So you can see there are negative inputs into you and positive inputs during your work as a PhD, for example, and that will change your coping reserve. And if your coping reserve becomes depleted, let's say, you would go into this burnout situation. So if you look at the positive input, so what feeds your cognitive reserve besides your own personal factors, you have the psychosocial support, having social or healthy activities, mentorship, like positive mentorship, and intellectual stimulation at your workplace. So some advices on how you may increase your coping reserve, and please take this with a grain of salt because there's not a lot of evidence on what works and what doesn't work. And for example, I'm going to even propose some things which have to do with work-life balance, and we just heard Inge said that in her analysis that didn't pick up as a risk factor. Nevertheless, those things are known to help in general in stress. So the first thing would be keep your balloons balanced. Okay? Do not overfeed one of your facets in life, because if that facet fails, then the other facets may not help you to cope. Find something that you feel you're being successful at. For me, during my PhD, in the worst and darkest times that there were, I started playing paddle, which is a sport you see this player play, which is let's say a mixture between tennis and squash, and that really helped me during those hour and a half. I was not doing a PhD. I was just trying to eat this yellow ball, and that helped me. Another thing is know yourself. I had a patient which was going through the process of burnout in academia, and then one thing that helped her a lot was she realized when she was more active, and she realized she was more active during a certain part of the day, so she concentrated her activities, the most demanding part, during the part of the day she was more active. So she just organized her work that in a way that the more demanding chores were done when she was more energetic. Learn to be able to cope with some ambiguity. That's hard. It's easier said than done, but it's something I see people having very hard time nowadays to do. And then take breaks. Breaks are very important. Some people, even a researcher in Sheffield University, even started the hashtag take breaks, make breakthroughs. And here you see a post of somebody that restarted skateboarding after 10 years just to get her mind off science. And then I won't repeat some of the stuff Inge said, but for example, the supervisors seem to play a big part. So it's really important for institutions to start having programs for supervisors to, on that part, minimizing the negative impact they have in this burning out process. Also, institutions, it's not only increasing your personal reserve, but one thing is the psychosocial support. So institutions should really have ways to engage students in gatherings and social events where they may know better each other. So what if it doesn't work? So I'm going to repeat, because it's very important what Gareth and Inge said. So if it doesn't work, so you try to cope with this and you cannot cope, you may first try to seek informal help, talk to a mentor, supervisor, someone you trust. They may have very important information, guide you through the process. Or even seek formal help. There is a lot of stigma against mental health, but mental health professionals are very capable, and we can really treat the symptoms when they arise. Anxiety and depression symptoms, I was telling you, they are treatable, and that does not mean medication. Some people are very afraid of medication, so they don't even go to a mental health professional because of that. There are many ways to treat. And non-pharmacological approaches have a very strong evidence base, like CBT, interpersonal psychotherapy, mindfulness, etc. And sometimes pharmacological approach is better, but mind that you should only do it if you have a physician prescribing you and monitoring you. That's it. Thank you for your attention. I just leave you here this article I find very interesting, very easy to read. Also, Project MedSci Life, where the Academy of Medical Sciences tries to promote life experience and more balanced work life. And start using your hashtag Take Breaks, Make Breakthroughs, and MedSci Life, and share your efforts to improve your coping reserve with your followers. Give the example. So that's it, Gareth.
Okay, thank you. Just make sure I'm not muted. Thank you, Joaquim. A question that came in, and maybe you can answer. What kind of training programs are available for supervisors, and would supervisors not have a stigma to attend them? So are you aware of perhaps training programs, for instance, at Champalimaud, and what do you feel about training programs for supervisors? And your camera is still on the presentation, if you could maybe switch it so we can see you.
All right. So in Champalimaud, there is a very, they do something very, very well, in my opinion, that Inge said, which is there are a lot of opportunities for PIs to engage with the students in a more informal environment. And that helps to build trust. That's true. I agree with what Inge said. In the university where I teach, they also have a program for supervisors. And it's a very good point on the stigma. So what I would say is that the best way is I wouldn't make a program for supervisors that advertised that the focus was on improving their communications with their students. I would make something more general, but include those packages in, so that people would take the whole thing. So they would get tools for other things like grant writing, etc. But at the same time, would get communication skills training. And also, as Inge said, and I totally agree, some training on how to recognize when somebody you are supervising is not well.
Okay, and just another question that came in related to, I think it was slide 15, the ability, you said about the ability to deal with ambiguity. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so as I said, it's easier said than done, but I think that is something that it's very important to start early on. Like it happens that as in medicine and research environments, many times people are kind of chosen into it, have a lot of obsessive traits. And when I mean obsessive, I'm not talking about disease. I'm talking about being highly organized, liking high predictable environments, being a person of habits, etc., and which is highly valuable in research up to a certain point. If everything is going well, or if you're doing a repetitive task, etc. When you need to take decisions under uncertainty, it can become very stressful for these people. And if you're asking me how do you train that, that's a very good question. I don't know how to give you a simple answer, but I guess you can get also, that's something you can even start training with like if you get in a situation where you are stressed and this is an issue, that's something that somebody with a cognitive behavioral training can help you to do, like setting up some homework assignments, for example, where people are encouraged to to take decisions under more ambiguity and then see the results. Right? That's the point. That is trying to see what happens if you do it.
Okay, thank you, Joaquim. I'm going to go on to our last speaker for now, and I'm going to put the screen. So our last speaker is Ekaterina, or as we know her, Katja Vinnik, who is a neuroscientist and research coach, and is going to talk about interpersonal communication under stress. So the floor is yours, Katja.
Gareth, thank you for the introduction. Hi, everybody. My name is Katja. I chose to speak about communication today because I believe it is crucial for any scientific work, and the way we communicate can either help us in what we do or further perpetuate the stress of the scientific work. So when discussing data with collaborators, writing grants, preparing for talk or job interviews, we implicitly rely on our existing abilities to communicate clearly. Stress affects communication in many different ways, usually making it harder to understand each other in difficult situations when we need it most. So we will be focusing today on discussing why this happens, what one can do about it, and specifically focus on situations of high stakes and high tension. So before we go there, I wanted to explicitly make sure we talk about it, that both resilience to stress and communication skills are not fixed traits. So they naturally change with experience. And communication skills can flourish in certain types of environments and may get corrupted by traumatic experiences. It is also possible to effortfully change habitual ways of communication and thus contribute to the changes in your environment, which will further sustain your own changes. I'm going to tell you a little anecdote demonstrating the impact of the culture and underlying beliefs as we have it on the communication in the times of stress. So there is an airline called Korean Air. It is known for its horrible air crash history. Between 1990s and 1970s and 1990s, they have lost 16 jets, and something like 700 people died on board of those planes as they crashed. When threatened to having their flying permit revoked by the authorities, the company needed to investigate. And as they did, they stumbled upon something really interesting. So they noticed that there were many more dangerous situations than the captain, typically a much more experienced pilot, was flying the plane and the co-pilot assisting, compared to the situations when co-pilot was flying the plane and the captain assisting. Weird, no? A more experienced captain at the controls should be a good thing. But apparently not in the situation if when the structure of relationship is very hierarchical. So there was a belief in Korean Air, it being an Asian company and a lot of pilots coming from the military background, that it is not beneficial to challenge the authority, and the subordinates were not welcome in doing it. And many pilots under stress perpetuated those patterns of behavior. They became even stronger. So in one of the crashes, for example, one of the co-pilots' readings were clearly indicative of the captain's error, yet he didn't even mention it to the captain. In another situation, the Korean Air plane was approaching one of the American airports, and as we know, in America, the culture of communication is much more assertive. So as the traffic was congested, the ground control bounced the plane to another turn, and despite the fact that they were running out of fuel, the pilots could not communicate to the ground control the danger of their situation, and they lost the plane. So this shows that in many different, even in life-threatening situations, people cannot give up their habitual patterns of behavior. Although after multiple interventions in Korean Air, which involved communication training and addressing the culture of the company, the situation improved, and the company has not lost a single plane since 1999. Let me put up the slides so that we could discuss further why this happens. So I hope you see them now. What the slide shows you is that at the core of our actions lie assumptions about the situation and beliefs about the self, others, and the world. So that not because something has happened, but because of our underlying beliefs about what has happened, the world and ourselves. So these sequences are mental habits, and addressing them is the basis for cognitive behavioral therapy, which Joaquim mentioned. It's an efficient therapy for depression and anxiety, the largest evidence-based base up to date. It is also a base for cognitive behavioral coaching, which we use to help people to achieve their goals through identifying beliefs that no longer serve them and acting from a more suitable source. Just to give an example, there was a postdoc who kindly gave me permission to share her story while changing some identifying details. During her studies, she developed a device that allowed to study fruit flies behavior at an entirely new level. So great temporal resolution, great throughput, really cool. And the science behind it was published. And there was a business opportunity to manufacture the devices and make it available to other laboratories, develop other devices based on this technology, and eventually make money. So she decided to start the company, and at some point got an appointment with a potential investor. Sounds like a cool start, no? Yet she felt miserable, procrastinated the preparations for that conversation, and considered canceling it. So this is the point where we had a session, and I was surprised to see her in such a state of mind. I prompted her to reflect on the underlying beliefs about the situation that made her feel so miserable. And it became clear that she was torn between two opposing mental patterns. So on one hand, she was afraid of losing the opportunity to scale her business, mixed up that this is not good enough, I'm not good enough thought pattern. So it's B in the beliefs in the ABC here. And on the other hand, she believed that accepting the investment will lead to losing some control of the company and some profit. After clearly defining her goal for this conversation, so present the project and see what terms they would offer without having to agree with them, she was also able to consider the other side, so what was there for them in that conversation. And it became clear to her that they neither wanted to test her in any sort of way, nor in that particular case were they interested in any degree of the control of the company. So she said that that realization allowed her to structure the conversation and position herself in a way to gain an offer of an investment of 2,100 euros. There is science to suggest that in stressful situations, people revert to habitual actions. It applies to both short-term and chronic stress. So for example, just 2 minutes of placing a hand in ice-cold water makes people less sensitive to the outcome of their actions. So they keep preferring a solution which was beneficial in the past, but was no longer necessary for them at that moment. It also made people much less consciously aware of the regularities behind the experiment. And this is just one of many of experiments suggesting that they have much less conscious awareness about our actions and about the situations under stress. This is not to mention chronic stress. It has been repeatedly shown that brain changes in chronic stress. In some areas of the brain, especially important for memory and goal-directed actions, parts of neurons physically shrink under chronic stress. The good news is that once the stress is over, it can revert back. So how can we hinder the influence of those habitual patterns of communication when we're in a hotspot? It is very difficult, and if a person is stressed, I would say it's next to impossible. What one can do, though, is to prepare for the upcoming challenging situation. So imagine you will have a conversation with your PI about results of several months of work, or you need to discuss the extension of your PhD thesis defense, or you want a salary rise, you name it. I would strongly advise to prepare not only for a scientific part of whatever you're going to talk about, but also for the actual conversation that you're going to have. So I would like to share today one tool which I find extremely helpful in helping people prepare for such challenging conversation. It's a little algorithm called Dear Man. It's useful for situations in which you need to ask for something or clearly say no to something. It is often difficult to make a position known, so how can we do it safely? Let's take an example of a postdoc who has 2 papers to resubmit, 2 projects running already, and then some PhD students who rely on her to prepare for an upcoming progress report. So in Dear Man, and then let me continue with that. So the supervisor sends her an email asking to take up yet another project and do experiments for that 3rd project. So what potentially can she do without threatening the relationship or giving it up completely? So D in Dear Man stands for describe the facts. They help the other to understand exactly what you're talking about. In addition, it is much more difficult to argue with facts. Do not confuse facts with feelings and attitudes at this point, and try to avoid generalizations. So sentences that start with always, never, etc. So, for example, in this case, what a postdoc could say, something like this. That is a really interesting project which you suggested. And although at the same time, and I really like it, although at the same time, there are 2 papers to be resubmitted, and the other 2 projects are running, and the PhD students will have their progress reports next month. Then do express your feelings and thoughts about the situation. Remember, other people do not know and cannot know what's inside you. At this point, it's beneficial to use I messages and avoid the word must. So for example, I feel happy that you have asked me to participate in this project and I like it. And at the same time, I'm worried that it will impede the other projects and delay by several months the resubmission of the papers. A stands for assert, clearly ask, or say no. Describe the desired as specific as possible. And remember, other people do not know how to read your thoughts. So for example, I would like to first resubmit the papers and then do those crucial experiments for X and Y projects and then start those experiments that you have proposed in June. R stands for reinforce. So tell the other why is it good for him or her to do the way you want. This often causes difficulty, especially if the situation is heated. It may be necessary to give up those strong feelings that arise, feelings of fear or feelings of guilt, to look at the other side and see what is there for the other side to be gained. For example, the postdoc in the situation could say, this way we will be sure that the PhD students have all the support they need for the rehearsal of the lab of rehearsal in the lab of progress reports, and we would get results of a year-long project, and then with our hands free, we can start the new experiment. M stands for mindful, so be mindful of your own control and reactions and thoughts. You can insist, do not switch to other topics, repeat the request or refusal again and again if needed. This is what you do to keep the conversation on track. It sounds easy, but it's actually very difficult, especially if another person strongly disagrees. What may help is to appear confident. So this A in Dear Man is my favorite. It is not necessary to feel confidence. It is enough to portray it. So look in the eyes, speak slowly, loud enough, stand straight. This helps the other person to take what you are saying seriously. N stands for negotiate. So discuss different options, bargain, ask the other person to suggest their solutions. But most importantly, listen. So try staying flexible and find the solution that works for either party. So do give a person as much time as needed to articulate his or her position. Don't interrupt. Make sure you understand exactly what another person is saying. And for this, a phrase, did I understand it correctly that you're suggesting such and such, is great. So for example, if we would be having a conversation, you could ask me, did I understand it correctly that rephrasing and repeating what another person is saying is useful? And I would say yes. It also helps another person to understand what you're actually listening to him or her. Before the conversation, once you have your main points outlined, it may be useful to rehearse it with a friend and ask what he or she feels and thinks about this presentation. So we never can see ourselves from the outside, and this is why another person's reflection is usually so helpful. This tool is very nice. It works. What usually doesn't is that if a situation is really heated, people tend to procrastinate not only the scientific part of the preparation, but also the human side of the preparation. So if this could be interesting for you, I would like to offer a little trick to combat this. So once you have scheduled your conversation with your calendar, do take time and do schedule a meeting do schedule a time to prepare for that meeting. If you know that that situation is really difficult or important to you, you can even schedule a second event so that if you end up missing or procrastinating the first one, you will have the second one to prepare. It works very well with those things that we know that we tend to postpone. And it also may be interesting to be aware of what happened when you miss that first time to prepare. It will give you information about what is it you're afraid, are you devaluing the importance of this presentation, or are there any other sources of delaying it. As Joaquim pointed out, there is no tool that suits us all. So when you notice other people interact in a fascinating way, do pay attention. Do break it down to its core components. Also notice phrases that work, like, did I understand it correctly? Or here's another one, works great in the beginning, all females to busy people. I know you're very busy, yet I would like to share this information with you. Do experiment and do try to expand the toolkit that works for you. All right, I hope it was useful. And if there is one thing you want to remember from all this talk, it's prepare. Before I give the floor to Gareth, I would like to share my contacts just in case it would be useful for someone. So if you're stuck when preparing something important, do reach out. Here's a link below that you can use to schedule a 20 minutes discussion to see if it would be useful for you to work for us to work together. And it also has my other contacts for any eventual questions. Thank you for your attention. Back to Gareth.
Thank you, Katja. Just quickly, I'll say that after the presentation on the YouTube Live link, I will give all contact details for all speakers. So if anybody wants to ask further questions, then they can contact everybody here in the panel directly. A question to you, Katja, because we seem to have a lot of questions coming up regarding training, whether it's for supervisors or for early career researchers. Do you think that institutions should offer or even mandate a course for early career researchers on coping with stress? And if they did, how would that course look?
I'm usually very skeptical about mandating things, especially those things which are very personal. So if it's imposed, then it can become unwanted. So I would rather offer it as a choice. And in fact, at Champalimaud, they ran a series of events called Autoscope for researchers to join if they would like to. The main aim for that was to raise, was to train self-awareness, essentially, to see how you act in certain types of situations, to learn from this, to learn about the underlying causes. I do believe those sort of general personal development and more specific scientific courses are very useful. And yes, definitely. Maybe it's better to do it outside of institutions so that people would see some unfamiliar faces, share it with some other people who are not immediate peers and see that, those problems of communication, difficulties with supervisors, self-care, sleep, stress, they are ubiquitous. They are prominent in academia throughout the world. And we know for sure about Europe. We don't yet know much about the other world, but I can say about Russia, I can say about some parts of Asia that worked. So it is ubiquitous. And yes, maybe online, maybe personal works better. Groups work great. If you have something really specific, then as Inge suggested, you can maybe go to your mentor or a coach if there is something that you need to do. I guess that's a good way to do it systemically, really.
Okay, thanks, Katja. I have a quick question for Inge, which came up. Inge, it relates back to the survey that you did on doctoral candidates in Leiden University, which was a kind of replica study of the study that had been done by Katja Levesque and her colleagues in Flanders. Would you be interested in having that study done nationally in the Netherlands and also in other countries across Europe, maybe even outside of Europe?
Yes, definitely. I hope that you can hear me. Yes, definitely. We are really interested to broaden this up and also to scale it up to other interested universities or countries. One thing that's good to know that for the Leiden study, we did this study all in our own spare time. So in our evenings and in our weekends, because nobody, also not from the university nor from the ministry, wanted to pay for this kind of research. So if you want to scale it up, then also a little bit of funding would be great.
Okay, so the answer is it's simply yes, and that basically we need to try and maybe get institutions and even governments to do a little bit more work on this.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maybe I can just say in the background, I know in the Netherlands that Leiden, especially you and your colleagues, but also the PhD network of the Netherlands, who's one of our members, has been really pushing for awareness on mental health, and they want to try and get these surveys going. And at a European level, Eurodoc is now trying to push for more of these surveys that are done according to the same methodology so that we can compare across Europe and try and find out to what extent this is a real problem. I have a question that came in, which I'll answer briefly. You can jump in if you want. The question was, how does specialist help work at the universities, or is there even specialist help at universities? Now, to my knowledge, there's not that much specific help or support for doctoral candidates and or postdoctoral researchers for mental health issues, but that is starting to change. So I know some universities, doctoral candidates or even postdocs can go and talk to either the student psychologist or a counselor, let's say, on a more general level. But I do know in the Netherlands at Delft University, and I think that's starting to also expand across the Netherlands, there is now an actual PhD psychologist who has been employed to strictly focus on any issues relating to doctoral candidates and or postdocs, and that this person is trained to help them with their specific issues. Do any of you know of a very specialist unit or a special person at a university or institution to help doctoral candidates and or postdocs with mental health issues? Inge.
Yes, thank you. As you said, already now in the Netherlands, also other universities are going to experiment for a short period of 3 or 6 months by appointing a PhD psychologist. So a person who is now transferring from Delft to Utrecht. So Utrecht University will now start for 6 months by appointing a PhD psychologist. And also the university in Tilburg is working on such a kind of PhD psychologist. Yeah.
Okay, so it's basically starting to kind of expand out. So maybe that's something else that we can push for nationally on a European level. I have another question tying mental health issues to career uncertainty. And I'd like to ask this to Joaquim. So the question is, what are the factors that create uncertainty for career development? In other words, how does career uncertainty link in with mental health issues? And what could you suggest to combat this?
Well, in my context, I believe in everyone's context. Uncertainty is a reality nowadays. In academia, uncertainty is for sure a reality. We just need to recall what Inge just said about the number of people that, and you also may stay in academia, the ones that don't stay. But Inge said something very important. One thing about, so we need to embrace uncertainty, and embracing uncertainty means also taking some risks, right? And those risks, what I mean by risks is not, I'm not saying crazy decisions or impulsive decisions. I say that we should embrace uncertainty, and even in face of uncertainty, take decisions. Otherwise, we'll be stuck, right? We'll be paralyzed. The problem is dealing with the results, right? Because sometimes the results will be bad, but dealing with this frustration also makes us grow, right? Here also, I believe that supervisors may have a very important role, because supervisors sometimes I had the chance to work with such a supervisor, which he would communicate that some things are uncertain, and there are no obvious choices, right? So sometimes you just need to choose something, right, and stick with that and work through that, right? And there's also other questions on ambiguity, and there is no formula. The only thing I may advise is that it will not get better unless you do it, right? Unless you challenge yourself and unless you take decisions even in uncertainty, right? And another thing that Inge said, it was very important. I usually say this when I give this burnout class to medical students, which is most of literature is done on burnout in students, is done in medical students, is that there are many exits from being a doctor or even a PhD, etc. There are many. Sometimes the uncertainty comes from people only imagining one scenario, the typical scenario. There are many more. So also talking with other people. That's why it's so important at the institutional level to promote the connecting between students and other people, and even the context outside of the institutes, right? There are many solutions. There are many other jobs out there that are not related directly to academia, but are very, let's say, how do you say this? They are very sorry, I'm missing the word. They are very challenging and very motivating.
Okay, I have a question actually I want to direct at Katja, and this ties to something that Joaquim said. So he had this scale of normal to pathological regarding anxiety and stress. And the question is, when you look at Inge's and Katja's survey, you see that when compared with the normal educated population, early career researchers are much higher on that scale. And the question I have, Katja, is obviously academia is a relatively stressful place. To what extent should we allow for stress? So where should we place it? Should it be the same as this higher educated population? Should it be a little more? Where should we draw that line? And if I pick simple standard figures, Inge can correct me. Let's just say the standard population is 20% showing signs of clinical depression. Doctoral candidates, postdocs are showing over 30. So, I mean, where should that be?
Gareth, that's an interesting question, which also reflects back on the fact that people that go to science, they are not exactly the same people that go to industry or something else, or like some other sectors. They do have this long-term planning thing. They also do tend to discount the immediate rewards and value rewards which are more distant in the future. So, and also I think Joaquim mentioned that they tend to be much more like organized, with some obsessive traits, maybe with some other traits. That's actually a further ground for this study, to see what are the personality traits that we tend to see in scientists. Probably like everybody working in science has their own answer, but then we do need studies, controlled studies, multi-center studies to actually see that. And then based on this, we would actually be able to control scientific population, not only with some highly educated people, but maybe with people with similar behavioral traits, similar character traits. I mean, in an ideal world, it would be cool to change the scientific community in a way that it would support itself, it would mend those wounds of failures. And yes, many experiments fail. Somebody said like science has 90% of failure. It's true, like you do an experiment that doesn't work, you figure out why it doesn't work, and then you do it again, and then, well, it fails again because there is like that another factor that needs to be taken in, and then eventually it works in some cases. So I think we need to change the community in a way that it would be able to support the members of the community, that the peers would be able to support themselves. And this is why I believe that developing coaching skills within the scientific community, so peers can be coaching peers and not just, be there giving advice or insisting that, like you should take care of yourself better, which usually doesn't work. I think that's important. So as we go through that step, I think people will learn to take the stress better. Yeah, I guess that's to say.
Thank you. I see we have a couple of minutes left, 3 minutes left. So what I'd like to do is just if you all take 1 minute, and I'd like to know what would your tips be for supervisors and early career researchers. So just very short, what would your tips be for supervisors and early career researchers on this topic? And I'd like to start with Inge. I see you're muted, Inge. Yep.
Yeah, excuse me. Now you can all hear me. For the supervisors, I looked at Leiden University to their course because 1.5 years ago they developed a course especially for young supervisors and more or less inexperienced supervisors. And the trainer was specialized in education development. She also did her PhD herself. And I looked at the training goals, and you can see that recognizing risks and warning signs by your PhD. That is one of the goals of that course. And also it has to do with training your conversation skills for giving feedback to your PhD candidates, but also developing different scenarios for frequently occurring difficult situations, so that you really are prepared also as a supervisor to have good talks with your PhD candidates. So that is one of the recommendations I have for supervisors. And in Leiden University, it's now compulsory for supervising PhD candidates. It's of course only 1.5 years ago that it started, and there are only 12 or 20 places available in the training. So it will take some time before we can really evaluate the course, but it's good that we are now that far. And I guess for the PhD candidates, I already had a lot of recommendations for them. But the most important one is that you start talking about mental health issues, stress-related things, also regarding your career, the career options, the transparency, especially if you communicate and you express your feelings with your peers. That's really the first step. And if the PhD supervisors already are also motivated or give them more insights and tools how to come up with that, start that conversation with the PhD candidates, then it's a win-win situation.
Thank you, Inge. And same question to Joaquim. So tips for supervisors and or PhD candidates and postdocs?
Well, so I guess it's easier for me to give advice for the PhD candidates or people doing the PhD because I feel more connected to that situation. First thing is never forget that what we are doing is wonderful, right? Working in science is it's a unique opportunity, and that's also should always be in the back of our mind. Having said this, take care of the balloons, right? Do not make this your only purpose. This is not you, right? This is something wonderful that you have the opportunity to do, but this is not everything that you do. So enrich your other facets of your life. So I'm saying this, if I would have gone back, the thing that I would change was I would add more time with my friends and family, for example, because I felt the only thing I regret about my PhD is growing some distance between friends that and well, not family, because my wife didn't let me to do it, right? She just, when things got worse, she just put me in line, right? But with friends, for example, that's my only regret. So keep in mind it's wonderful what we do. Don't get intoxicated by it. Okay, so keep things real. Don't forget what you are before you got there. This can be more challenging for students which are outside of their where they grew and their structured environment. And for those, I would encourage them to work as hard as they work in their experiments, work in building a social network where you are at that moment.
Okay, thank you. And the last question I want to send to Katja. So tips for supervisors and or PhD candidates, postdocs.
Well, I guess for the PhD candidates and postdocs, my suggestion would be to explore yourself as you're exploring the outside world. So we all have those microscopes or telescopes with which we explore the reality as it is. So our inner clockwork is not less fascinating. So then that's, wonderful to observe oneself, to see whether you react in the way you would expect yourself to react in certain types of situations, and just take it as a journey, really. So when we explore the world around us, it is a journey that don't know where we will stop, like we don't know even the purpose in a way sometimes, right? So it's the same with self-awareness. So we can benefit a lot from this, and here all tools are good. So mindfulness, talking to friends, listening carefully to what your supervisors tells you, because they're a great source of feedback, even though sometimes it's not given in a very digestible way, but hopefully it will improve one day. So this brings me to the topic of the PhD advisors, and also I would like to include their postdocs who aim to go to the leadership positions. Take a good industry-grade leadership course. That's something science, distance itself completely. It's not even in the horizon of many people, but leadership is really important for keeping the team mentally sane as one of the things, but also it helps in making it more productive, and it helps to keep the supervisors more mentally fit. So yeah, I guess great leadership is something that I would suggest to work towards.
Okay, thank you, Katja. And I want to say on behalf of Eurodoc and on behalf of all of our audience members, especially in the comments and the live chat section, which I know you guys can't see directly, thank you for participating in the webinar, for giving your presentations and for giving these tips and tricks. What I would also like to say is thank you to our social media coordinator at Eurodoc, Julia Malaguernera. She organized the poster and she's organized a lot of the chats and answering people's questions on the back end here. So thank you to her too. And a final point from my side is that this video as soon as we hang up, this video will be automatically uploaded to YouTube under the exact same link that people watched it on YouTube Live. And if people look down in the description of the video, they will see links to all of the presentations that were given here today. And there will also be links to all speakers and their contact email addresses. So if anybody wants to contact any of the speakers, then they are free to do that with questions or comments. So I would like to say, with no further ado, thank you to everybody. I hope everybody manages to stay sane in academia, and we will see you all again in a future webinar here at Eurodoc. So thank you, everybody, and have a nice day. Goodbye.